Night settled over the desert like a heavy cloak. The fire outside the tent burned low, its light trembling against the endless dark. The stars watched in silence. A child shifted in his sleep. A shepherd's staff lay against a travel pack, ready for a journey toward Egypt. Moses was awake because he had not slept since the mountain. Across from him, Zipporah watched without speaking. She had learned the language of his silence over the years. When he was troubled, he did not pace. He stilled, as if bracing against something unseen. Suddenly, the fire bent sideways even though there was no wind. The air tightened. Moses' breath caught in his chest. His body stiffened, then convulsed as if seized by an invisible hand. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his throat. Zipporah rushed to him. "Moses." She called, but he could not answer her, and then she felt it. It was not sickness or fear. She shivered because it was a presence. The same presence he had described years ago, the fire that burned but did not consume, the voice that called his name from flame, the holy that had sent him back toward the empire he once fled. But this was not calling. This was judgment. Moses' eyes rolled back. His strength drained as though life itself were being drawn out of him. And in that terrible stillness, Zipporah understood that this was not about Egypt. This was about obedience. Years earlier, Moses had run from Egypt with blood on his hands. A prince raised among power, yet never fully Egyptian. A Hebrew by birth, yet foreign to his own enslaved people. He had tried to become deliverer in a single violent act. One Egyptian buried in sand, one impulsive strike, and then exile. Moses ran to Midian. Midian did not know his past. Midian did not care. He became a shepherd. He married the daughter of a priest, and he built a life quiet enough to bury ambition. Zipporah had seen the fracture in him from the beginning, the way he stared at horizons as if something waited beyond them, the way he carried both strength and shame in equal measure. She quickly realized that she had not married a hero. She had married a man hiding from himself. The had years softened him. Fatherhood had grounded him. The fire dimmed until the mountain burned. He came home that day altered, not wild, not afraid, but awakened. He told her about the bush that would not turn to ash, about the voice that knew him. He then told her about the command to return to Egypt and demand the freedom of slaves. She listened attentively and asked a simple question. "Will this God protect you?" she asked quietly. Moses did not answer immediately. That silence unsettled her more than the story of fire. Still, she chose to go. She didn't understand the calling, but she understood the man she had married. But there had been tension long before the journey. A small thing, Moses had called it, a matter of covenant, circumcision, the ancient sign given to Abraham, a mark carved into flesh, declaring belonging to the God of Israel. It was not her custom or tradition, and she couldn't comprehend it. Perhaps they argued when their first son was born. Perhaps Moses postponed it, weary of conflict. Perhaps he convinced himself that God would understand delay. Leadership on mountains was easier than obedience in tents. The child remained uncircumcised, and Moses moved forward with unfinished obedience trailing behind him like a shadow. Now that shadow had become a storm. Moses' body writhed in the dust. His breath came in shallow gasps. The unseen presence pressed heavier. Zipporah's mind raced. If this God was powerful enough to confront Pharaoh, he was powerful enough to strike down his own servant. She realized that this was not cruelty. It was covenant. Deliverance would require a man who was fully aligned with the God who had sent him, not partially or in the future, but immediately. Zipporah's gaze moved from her husband to her son. Her heart pounded. And then she got angry, first at Moses. Why had Moses delayed this? Why had he carried divine mission while neglecting divine command? Then her anger dissolved into clarity. If she did nothing, Moses would die. History would end in this desert. She grabbed a sharp flintstone from their supplies. Her hands trembled, not from fear of blood, but from the weight of what this meant. She was stepping into a covenant not born from her culture, but demanded by her husband's calling. She knelt and held the child. The child cried out, but the desert absorbed the sound. With firm hands and tears, she refused to shed. She performed what Moses had postponed. Blood touched sand. She rose, stepped toward her collapsing husband, and touched the sign of covenant to him. "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." The words carried frustration, sacrifice, and fierce love. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the pressure lifted and the air loosened. Moses drew in a deep, shuddering breath as if surfacing from deep water. Life rushed back into him. The unseen presence withdrew. Silence returned to the desert. Zipporah stood there, chest heaving, hands stained red. She had just saved the man who would confront Pharaoh. She had just stood between divine judgment and divine promise, and no one would sing about it. Morning came quietly. Moses rose weaker, humbled beyond language. He did not speak much. Something in him had broken, not his faith, but his illusion of partial obedience. He had argued with God at the bush, negotiated, resisted, and God allowed him, but now he understood. The God who calls is the God who demands, and covenant is not symbolic. It is binding. He looked at Zipporah differently that morning, not merely as his wife or companion in exile, but as the one who preserved his life when heaven moved against him. Yet something unspoken lingered between them. Even though she had acted decisively to save his life, it had cost her. She had entered his covenant through blood, but hers was not gentle. It was forced by crisis. Love saved him, but obedience would now define him. The journey to Egypt continued. Moses walked with a quieter authority, not the boldness of a man who assumes protection, but the steadiness of one who has survived correction. Zipporah walked beside him, carrying both strength and ache. History would remember the plagues and the parted sea, the thunder at Sinai. Few would remember the night deliverance almost died in a desert tent. Few would remember that before Moses stretched out his staff over the Red Sea, his wife had stretched out her hand over covenant. Before he confronted Pharaoh, he was confronted by God. Before he led a nation, he was nearly judged alone. And the difference between a fallen prophet and a deliverer was one woman who refused to let delayed obedience end destiny. The desert never spoke of it, but the stars that watched that night never forgot. Because sometimes salvation does not begin in palaces or plagues. It begins in a quiet tent with blood on the sand and a wife who understands covenant better than the man called to carry it. Dawn did not celebrate what had happened. It arrived softly, as if afraid to disturb the memory of the night. The desert looked the same. The sky stretched wide and indifferent. The fire had burned down to ash, but inside the tent, nothing was the same. Moses sat upright, breathing slowly, as though testing whether breath would remain loyal to him. His body felt heavier than it had the day before, not weak, aware. Every inhale felt borrowed, every heartbeat felt permitted. Across from him, Zipporah wrapped their son in cloth with steady hands. But she did not look at Moses, not yet. There are moments in marriage when love acts faster than understanding, and afterward, silence must carry what words cannot. Moses finally spoke. I should have done it. It was not an excuse. He wasn't defending himself. He was just speaking the truth. Zipporah tied the final knot on the cloth and stood. Yes, she said. There was no anger in her tone. That was worse. He rose slowly. The staff in his hand felt different now. It was no longer a symbol of calling. It was a reminder of survival. He had argued with God at the mountain. He had negotiated terms. He had requested signs. But the night before had stripped all negotiation away. He now understood something he had not before. God was not recruiting him. God was claiming him, and claims require alignment. The journey resumed, but the air between them had changed. Zipporah walked slightly behind, their son against her chest. Moses walked ahead, not from dominance, but from distance. He was replaying the night repeatedly in his mind, the sensation of breath leaving, the absolute helplessness, the awareness that the God who commissioned him could just as easily end him. It did not make him bitter, it made him sober. For 40 years he had believed his greatest failure was killing the Egyptian. Now he saw deeper. He saw that his greatest danger was selective obedience. He had been willing to confront Pharaoh, but not fully confront his own home. The irony humbled him. The desert stretched endlessly ahead. Somewhere beyond it lay Egypt, unchanged, powerful, brutal. But Moses was no longer the man who had fled it. Fear still existed in him, but had lost his pride, and something else had been born, reverence for the one who had called him. Days later, as the terrain shifted and the familiar roots of Midian thinned behind them, Zipporah stopped walking. Moses, he turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes were resolved. I will not go into Egypt. The words were not accusation, they were clarity. He waited for an explanation. I walked beside you into the desert. I walked beside you toward your calling. But Egypt is not my battle. The unspoken truth hovered between them. The God who nearly killed him had marked their family with blood. She had obeyed under pressure, but she would not stand in the shadow of Pharaoh's court, watching heaven and empire collide. Especially not with their sons, and the memory still so fresh, and that was when Moses felt the fracture. It was not betrayal, but separation, and he understood. Egypt would not be a short confrontation. It would be escalating defiance, power against power, sign against sign. It would be dangerous, and he had already brought danger into their tent once. He nodded slowly. You will return to your father. It was both permission and concession. She studied him, as if measuring whether he resented her, but he did not. He felt the cost, but he did not resent her for the decision. That night, under a sky thick with stars, they lay side by side one last time before the road would divide. They did not sleep. Even though their love was not loud, it had been tempered by survival and strengthened by fire. Unfortunately, it had also fractured by his calling. At dawn, she left with their sons, heading back toward Midian. Moses watched until the horizon swallowed them. Then he turned toward Egypt, alone. Solitude sharpened his thoughts. As he approached the borderlands of the empire he once called home, memories surged. The polished floors of the palace, the echo of royal commands, the taste of privilege, and beneath it all, the guilt of a buried body in sand. But now another memory overshadowed even that, the desert tent, the invisible presence, how his life felt slipping away. He realized something that startled him. He feared God more than Pharaoh. And that realization changed everything. When a man fears losing breath at the hand of heaven, the threats of kings lose their weight. He was no longer returning as a fugitive trying to redeem his past. He was returning as a servant who had been corrected, and that correction reshaped his psychology. He stopped rehearsing persuasive speeches, stopped imagining how he would defend himself before Pharaoh. Instead, he repeated the words spoken from the bush. I am has sent me, not Moses the prince, avenger or exiled, just a messenger who had been humbled, but beneath that steadiness lay something unresolved. He had nearly died because of what he neglected, and Zipporah had acted decisively and brave and with anger, and he wondered what she thought of him now. Was he still strong in her eyes, or merely chosen? There is a difference. Chosen men are not always impressive, but they are always accountable, and accountability had nearly cost him his life. When Moses and Aaron finally stood before Pharaoh, the throne room shimmered with gold and defiance. The ruler of Egypt did not see a humbled shepherd. he saw a former prince who had lost his mind. "Let my people go." The words echoed through marble halls. Pharaoh laughed. The first refusal came easily. Power rarely yields at first request. But Moses did not flinch, because the desert had already broken his illusion of control. This was no longer about winning arguments. It was about obedience. Outside the palace, the Nile flowed strong and confident. Inside Moses' chest, something was different. He felt small, but not weak. He knew he had survived God's anger, and so even though he now faced human arrogance, what he feared was different now. Yet even as miracles began to unfold, water to blood, signs before court magicians, there were moments in the quiet between confrontations when his mind returned to the tent, to Zipporah's voice. "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." He carried that sentence like a hidden scar. Publicly, he stood as prophet. Privately, he knew he had almost failed before beginning. Every plague announced God's supremacy over Egypt, but every sign also reminded him this mission is holy, and holiness is not casual. At night, when he lay alone, far from Midian, he sometimes wondered whether Zipporah regretted marrying a man claimed by a God so fierce. He wondered if distance would grow between them like desert miles. Calling had elevated him in the eyes of Israel, but it had complicated his marriage. Leadership often does, because miracles shine outward while sacrifices always hide inwards. As Pharaoh's heart hardened, so did the confrontation. Frogs covered the land, gnats filled the air, livestock fell, darkness swallowed the sun. With each plague, Egypt trembled. With each refusal, tension tightened. And Moses felt it building towards something irreversible. The God who had nearly ended him for delayed obedience would not hesitate to judge a nation built on oppression. If covenant mattered in a tent, how much more in an empire? One night, after another defiant refusal from Pharaoh, Moses stood outside the palace gates and looked toward the heavens. The air felt heavy again, not with the threat he had felt in the desert, but with inevitability. He sensed the next judgment would not be like the others, not inconvenience, not discomfort. Final, and somewhere far from Egypt, in Midian, a woman who once stood between death and destiny had no idea that another night of reckoning was approaching, a night when blood would again mark survival. But this time, not in a desert tent, in every Hebrew home. Moses closed his eyes. The memory of that first night returned, the breath stolen and the blood spilled, which led to a life spared. He understood now that God had not come to destroy him instead. He had come to prepare him, because the plague that was coming would demand a leader who understood the weight of covenant. The wind shifted, the silence deepened, and in the distance Egypt slept, unaware that the most devastating judgment was about to fall. Dawn did not celebrate what had happened. It arrived softly, as if afraid to disturb the memory of the night. The desert looked the same. The sky stretched wide and indifferent. The fire had burned.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, smash that subscribe button and join our community. And hey, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from, what you think, or what you'd love to see next. Here we go, deep into the Bible and bring you an interesting story. They never taught you in Sunday school. Let's get the conversation going and make this channel even better together. See you in the next video.